Tonight, we mark World AIDS Day 2004 with a very special speaker. Dr. Pride Chigwedere is here to speak as an Oak Foundation Fellow at the Harvard AIDS Institute. He became involved in the AIDS epidemic while working as a physician in Zimbabwe. Dr. Chigwedere now works with a team of researchers who are trying to design a subtype-specific HIV vaccine for South Africa. Would you help me in welcoming Dr. Chigwedere?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and welcoming me. And thank you all for coming. I'm honored to be here to share what I have to share with you. I think this is a very important topic. AIDS is probably the biggest challenge, health challenge, from an infectious diseases point of view that faces the world, and probably that has faced the world in the known history of mankind. What I want to do is to discuss points that are fairly obvious, points that come up in general discussions about the HIV epidemic, and that is why this first slide is critical. I don't mean to offend you by defining what science is, especially at a museum of science. I know all of you know what science is, but I wish to emphasize a few points regarding the scientific approach to analysis and interpretation of the epidemic, because in my opinion, that is one of the fundamental problems with the way we look at the AIDS epidemic and the way we try to design measures, interventions, to try and control the epidemic. So science is essentially an ordered approach to knowledge, and I've chosen a very broad definition so that I'm not restricting myself to immunology or molecular biology or some of the more exact sciences. What I essentially mean is that we're searching for the truth. We have to use fairly standard laws of derivation, methods of investigations, and evidence is critical in whatever we deduce. And that is essentially what I want you to take note of in everything that I'm going to speak about. So I'll speak on fairly obvious points, but if we keep these things in mind, then we will be inquisitive. We'll question every statement that is made, that is taken as fact, and I think we'll probably come up with a slightly different interpretation from what we hear every day. So what I'm going to do is move from descriptive aspects, simply describe what the epidemic is like, and then move into the probable determinants. And by probable determinants, I'm looking at the factors that may be responsible for explaining why the epidemic is more severe in Africa than in the rest of the world. And this is important because the probable determinants direct us, guide us in coming up with solutions. If we think AIDS is a problem of poverty, it inevitably means that one of the solutions is to try and control poverty. If we think it is a problem of education, if we think it is strictly a biomedical problem, that guides us into the kind of solutions that we seek. So I'm going to take those steps, and I will not cover everything. It is essentially impossible to. This is a very big field. So I'll do a few things, point at a few critical factors and analyze them, question the validity of what we are normally told or what we regard as the conventional wisdom, and hopefully move into interpreting what is exactly happening. So this slide, this is a picture that I simply downloaded from the United Nations AIDS website, UNAIDS website, and the colors denote HIV prevalence. Now, prevalence is simply the percentage of the population that is infected with HIV and AIDS. And the numbers that are quoted are usually prevalence in the adult population. So HIV is mainly a disease of the sexually active, at least in Africa. And then the prevalences that are quoted here are from the UN website for adult population. There are currently about 40 million people that are infected with the HIV virus. And estimates are that 25 or 30 million people have already died because of the AIDS epidemic. This is the distribution in the world. And then these red colors, this very deep blood red color, indicates the highest prevalence of 20 to 40%, and then that's essentially in Southern Africa. This represents prevalence of 5 to 20%, the lighter red, and the prevalence generally goes down as the colors get lighter and lighter. Now, approximately 2/3 of the 40 million people that are infected are in Africa. And Africa is only 10% of the world population, to give you an idea of how serious it is. So we're talking of roughly 28 million people that are infected in Africa. And then sub-Saharan Africa, to be specific. So there is the Sahara Desert in this region. These dark colors start here. That's what we call sub-Saharan Africa. And then most of the infections are in sub-Saharan Africa. So 2/3 of the infections are in sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at just the segment of women, and this is particularly important because this World AIDS Day has been dedicated to women, the prevalence, the percentage of infections in Africa rises to approximately 75%. 75% of the infections in women occur in Africa. And then the reasons are fairly simple. When the disease was first described here in the US, it was a disease noted in gay men. And the other method of spread is by use of intravenous drugs. And those two methods are not too common in Africa. In Africa, it is a heterosexual epidemic. So you get more women infected in Africa. That is primarily the reason. If you go to the countries of the former Soviet Union, the epidemic is spreading mainly due to intravenous drug use and also homosexual spread. So in Africa, women are more affected, and 75% of the infections in women are in Africa. If we move to the people that are dying, and UNAIDS estimates that there were 3 million deaths last year, the percentage is 85% for Africa. And then the reasons are, again, fairly simple. In the rest of the world, there are now drugs, the so-called antiretroviral drugs or highly active antiretroviral therapy. And in Africa, it is essentially non-existent. Very few people, less than, I think, 1 or 2% are getting those medications. So in the rest of the world, people are surviving because of these medications, but they don't exist in Africa. So when you look at the deaths, of those 3 million deaths, 85% are in Africa. If you move beyond that and look at the number of children that are infected, it rises to between 90 and 95%. And the reasons are, again, one, children are born by women, and the epidemic affects women more than in the rest of the world. And number two is that women in Africa generally have more kids than in the rest of the world. So if you bring those two factors together, it rises to 90 to 95% of the children that are infected are in Africa. So that's how serious the epidemic is, and that's how serious it affects sub-Saharan Africa. If we restrict ourselves to sub-Saharan Africa, the picture is not uniform. It affects Southern Africa more than Eastern Africa and Central and Western Africa. In Southern Africa, and these are all the countries here, the prevalence is essentially greater than 20% in the adult population. In other words, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 adults is infected with HIV in all these countries. And then there is South Africa, and inside South Africa there is Lesotho and Swaziland. This is Botswana, this is Zimbabwe, this is Namibia, this is Mozambique at about 15% prevalent, this is Zambia. So in all these countries, roughly 1 in every 5th person is HIV infected, and then that's how serious the epidemic is. I come from Zimbabwe, this little country here, north of South Africa and east of Botswana. And the prevalence is 33%, one-third. One-third of the adult population is infected with the virus. And that is as as Sheila has indicated, that is how I came face to face with the virus. I did my medical training at the University of Zimbabwe and then did residence in the central hospitals. So all the persons who get HIV develop, progress and develop AIDS, and they are referred from wherever they are to the district hospitals, to the provincial hospitals, and then to the central hospitals. And central hospitals are the teaching hospitals where I did both the medical training and the residency. And regardless of the specialty rotations that we're doing, we're faced with these AIDS patients. In internal medicine, that's where they generally come, and they have opportunistic infections, cryptococcal meningitis, pneumocystis, pneumonias, several cancers, lymphomas, Kaposi sarcoma. And we didn't have any medications to give them. And essentially my duty as a resident, as a junior doctor, was to stand by them and watch them die. Now, the hierarchies in hospitals are such that you have a professor or a consultant, and then you have the junior doctor who's the resident. And he is the one who's supposed to be there who doesn't leave the hospital. And my duty was to be there. If a patient collapses, they blip you, the resident doctor, you go and resuscitate. And if you don't have medications, you tell the relatives we're doing all that we can to help the patient. And what you really mean by that is that we're doing nothing because we didn't have the drugs. And not just the antiretroviral drugs, but even the drugs to treat some of the opportunistic infections. Drugs needed to treat cryptococcal meningitis, itraconazole, fluconazole, are very expensive. Fortunately, Pfizer has donated that to many countries in Africa. The drugs to treat Kaposi sarcoma, that's a cancer, that's chemotherapy. And the drugs, we didn't have them. The drugs to treat many other infections. So we were there, standing by. And then you don't leave because it is your job, watching them. And they die, and you certify them, pupils dilated and fixed, and you tell the relatives that we did all we could. And what you essentially mean is that we didn't do anything. So that is broadly the picture of the epidemic. The world picture, it affects specifically Africa, greater toll on women and children in Africa, and especially in Southern Africa. 1 in every 4th person is infected with the epidemic. It is destroying families, it is destroying education, it is destroying mining, agriculture, it is destroying the fabric of the society. Right. So that's the descriptive aspect. This is the epidemic as it is. And I'll take a step further into the analysis. So when one is faced with a picture such as this one, the question comes, why Africa? And why Southern Africa? And that's where the scientific methods are needed, especially for a complex disease such as this. So there are many ways of approaching it, and this stage of the analysis is generally called hypothesis making. So disease is affecting Africa, not Western Europe and the US to the same extent. So what's the difference between developing countries and developed countries? And then people come up with these hypotheses. Probably education, and generally Africa is less literate than the rest of the world, so education could be an important factor, and then some people have labeled it a disease of poverty. Perhaps it is cultural differences, and what is culture? It is a total way of life. It doesn't exactly point us at what the difference is. Perhaps it is economic differences, and generally when you look at the economic data, gross domestic product, we one of the poorest regions in the world. It could be many other things at that broad level, at the macro level. Some people have even pointed at governments. Perhaps it is the way the governments are handling the epidemic, and that is a reasonable hypothesis. If you look at it based on transmission, this disease, this virus is transmitted sexually. You could come up with a set of hypotheses on why there is this difference. So you could say the people in Africa have multiple partners. When you have multiple partners, you get the disease from somebody and you pass it on to somebody else. And this could be at the same time, or it could be sequential. So polygamy, prostitution, perhaps. Some people have looked at what they call the cofactors in sex, and then you're looking at things like use of condoms, And there's a lot of literature on other things, post-coital hygiene, which is practiced in certain regions of the world. Perhaps sexually transmitted infections are important in aiding transmission. And it makes intuitive sense because sexually transmitted infections cause irritation, cause inflammation, and some of them even ulcers. So it may enable transmission of the infection. And many other factors associated with sex. This disease is caused by a virus, so there could be viral factors. And people suggest things like, perhaps there are different strains of the virus, and the one that is affecting Africa is slightly different from the ones that are affecting the rest of the world. So if you look at these factors in an organized way, from the infectious agent, to the host, and then to the broader cultural, environmental factors, that's the approach we use in public health. And then you list down all possibilities. You come up with 50 things, 100 things, and if you ask somebody, depending on their training and what they would want out of the epidemic, they will tell you perhaps the best solution is religion. This thing is sexually transmitted. What we need to do is go and inculcate some morals in Africa. And it could be reasonable, at least based on differences. The North Africa and this region is mainly, the religion in this region is Islam, versus Christianity and a mixture of Islam and traditional religion in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a reasonable hypothesis. But then it is insufficient, and then that is why I go back to the science. It is insufficient to end there and accept dogmatically that it is religion, or it is education, or it is poverty. We have to move a step beyond that and analyze critically. And that's where the science comes into it. Analyze whether it is education. And if it is education, to what extent does it explain the differences that we see in the world? And the greatest importance of this is that it guides us at the kind of solutions that we'll seek. So I will analyze just one or two. I think sexual transmission is key in the sense that many people who perhaps would have been willing to assist Africa are not, because they look at it as a disease of immorality. If these Africans learn to control their passions, they'll be able to take care of the epidemic. So I'll show you a few slides very quickly to indicate otherwise. Now, this is a slide that I took from the World Health Organization website, and it indicates the incidence, and the incidence are new infections of sexually transmitted infections, and then the data that is available is for 1995, and this is again a global picture. And it tells us that in Asia there were 150 million infections, in Africa 65 million infections, and these are the infections in the rest of the world. There are a few regions that are not there, so if you add this, it doesn't get to 333 million. But I'm showing this because sexually transmitted infections are transmitted sexually. And this gives you an idea of whether Africans are more promiscuous or whether they are more immoral, as it has been suggested. And if you have 150 million infections in Asia, it is consistent with the large population of Asia. And these infections in America, 14 million, in Europe, 16 million. And if you factor in, the use of antibiotics, because most of these are treated by the antibiotics that are generally available, you come up again with a hypothesis, some data suggesting that perhaps there aren't too large differences between the sexual behavior of people. This is one way, and this kind of data, we call it a proximate analysis for sexual behavior, because we're not looking at sexual behavior directly, we're looking at it through the consequences. If you look at condoms available, there has been a lot of problems with the data that you get from asking people, are you using condoms? And everybody tells you yes. But the best way of looking at it, at least one of the ways of looking at it, is looking at the total number of condoms that are available in a country and compare whether they match with what people are telling you. And for example, in Africa, we don't manufacture any condoms. In Zimbabwe, we import them from Malaysia, from a company called Donkek. So you know that last year there were 50 million condoms that came into the country. And you simply divide by the adult population. and you come up with these numbers. So this is the number for Zimbabwe, and it is actually the largest in the world. You know, this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda with 6, Tanzania 3, and for comparison here, some countries in Europe, United Kingdom 5.5, France 5.3. And I'm not trying to argue that these numbers are anywhere close, you know, to the sexual activity of persons in these countries. But what I'm doing is just a comparison to see whether it is differences in condom usage or condom availability in these countries that explains the epidemic. And this kind of data suggests that, you know, it is probably not. Surveys have been done, you know, to report non-regular sexual partners. The problem with this kind of data is that it is difficult to find surveys that have been done in roughly the same way so that the comparisons between countries and regions are valid. But this I got from the UNAIDS website. And it tells you, it gives you Zimbabwe 20, Uganda 25, Libya 22, UK 27, Cuba 49. And I'm not interested in the specific numbers. It is the general picture. Are we going to conclude that Southern Africa is much worse than the rest of the world, you know, in terms of the number of sexual partners they have? So this goes back to my first slide, you know, that these are the generally accepted truths or the wisdom. You know, Africa is suffering because they are more immoral. They have multiple sexual partners. They don't use condoms. And if we accept that, then we all lose heart. We're going to assist these people who are not even willing to assist themselves. And I'm not saying having multiple partners is a good thing. I'm only saying that they are behaving in the manner that Americans behave, in the manner that Europeans or Asians behave. And if we accept that this is human behavior, then we look for different solutions. And that is why I show you this data. There is a lot of data. I've just picked this, you know, to put doubts into your minds regarding what is generally popular wisdom. Now, I will leave this. I just wanted to give you a snippet of one of the determinants and whether you conclude that it is the appropriate determinant, you know, to explain the epidemic. I will give you two interesting observations that could probably explain why the epidemic is as it is, and they are very uninteresting, and that is why people prefer, you know, to talk about sex rather than what is probably the right determinants. Now, one is simply where did HIV originate, and by originate, I'm simply referring to geographical origins and perhaps time origins, rather than the fancier theories of who started HIV, how, or did it jump from another species. Now, HIV was first described in the US, and there are specific reasons for that. You know, the health system is very developed here. The communication between different physicians via the journals, via the CDC is very effective. So some physicians in San Francisco did notice that there was this pattern of immunosuppression that was occurring in young adults, specifically homosexual men. And then they communicated that, and then physicians became alert, and quickly everybody in 1981 realized that there was a new immunosuppression. So HIV the disease was first reported from the US, and there were many studies, you know, to indicate that it was sexually transmitted, later blood transfusion, later mother-to-child transmission, and people did immunological, virological studies and identified that HIV was the cause in 1983. But what I'm interested in is that after the assay was there, you know, there were reports that came from Uganda that there is this wasting disease, this immunosuppression that is similar to what has been described in the US. And they are stored samples, for example, for blood banking purposes that people could now go back to, you know, and analyze, did we have this HIV virus in 1979, in 1975? And the problem with Africa is that, you know, we don't have blood banking, or then, you know, blood banking wasn't that advanced and the storage of samples wasn't that good. But people ran around all Africa collecting whatever samples they could, and confirmed that it existed in 1976, confirmed that it existed in 1969, and the earliest sample that tested positive was from Zaire in about 1959. And the same tests were done in the rest of the world. And it is very clear that the epidemic originated in Africa. from a geographical point of view. And this is important. If you introduce a new infection, call it SARS or anything new in Boston, you will see the epidemic growing in Boston here before it grows in San Francisco, before it grows in Japan, or before it grows in Africa. And if we accept just that simple fact, that whatever happened, the epidemic geographically originated in Africa, it explains a big chunk of the differences that we see between Africa and the rest of the world. The other more sophisticated methods that have been used include what is called a phylogenetic clock. And this is genetic analysis of the HIV strains. They are not identical, they differ. HIV, when it replicates, when it multiplies, the enzyme that multiplies, it usually makes one mistake in every replication. So when you look at the mistakes and the relationship of the mistakes, because when you get progeny, daughter viruses, they have a mistake in a certain position, and they replicate, they add another mistake. You can sort of trace back and back and back. So when you analyze the global HIV epidemic, and you go back tracing the mutations, people come up with what is called a phylogenetic clock, and these studies were done at the Los Alamos Center in New Mexico and at the University of Alabama. And they published that from the relationships of the various strains of HIV that we have, HIV probably started around 1920s or 1930s, and then its site, its geographical location was probably in Africa, and did spread slowly, and it expands sort of exponentially. And this is another way of trying to locate the origin, and then probably why the epidemic spread faster in Africa than the rest of the world. And then I've already indicated the implications. So this is an interesting point, and that's why exactly people discard it and prefer to talk of sex. It is more interesting to talk of sex and morality, and then you get all sorts of philosophies and politics, once you introduce that. And I have these maps to illustrate what I've been saying. This is from UNAIDS again, from 1988. This is the picture of HIV. Central Africa, Central and Southern Africa. This is Zambia here. In 1993, it is expanding in this region. This is 1998, Southern Africa. And if you include the rest of the world, this is exactly what we're saying. It started in Africa and it has spread to the rest of the world. And where is the epicenter? Exactly somewhere where it started. The second possible explaining factor of the differences between the prevalences that we see in Africa and the rest of the world concerns the diversity. From an infectious diseases point of view, if the flu epidemic this year is worse than it was last year, and I'm not hinting at the vaccine problems, people say this strain is more virulent or more pathogenic, or this is a worse strain. And this is common thinking, at least in infectious diseases. And virologists who worked on HIV were quick to suggest that as an explanation. Perhaps the strains that we're dealing with in Africa are more transmissible or more virulent or more pathogenic. These terms describe related things. And studies were done. So HIV was described in 1983 by Robert Gallo and Luc Montagna. And by 1985, 1986, and these studies were done actually at the Harvard School of Public Health by my current advisors, Mark Sussex and Phyllis Kanke. They indicated that there was a variant which was later called HIV type 2, based on reactions of the core differences in reactions to the envelope proteins and the core proteins compared to what had been described. And when molecular techniques became available so that you could sequence every nucleotide in the genome, they came up this classification that type 1 was the major type, and then it was divided into these groups, M for major, O for outlier, N for non-M, non-O. And this group M was further classified into these different subtypes. And it was later shown that these subtypes, can sort of rearrange. You can get a piece from subtype A and a piece from subtype B. And that recombination led to what are called circulating recombinant forms, and I think 1 to 15 have been described. So what is this significance? What is the significance of this scheme? You know, studies have been done to show that this is essentially a genetic scheme. You know, studies have been done to show that there are differences in the culture characteristics when you culture the virus, what they call the phenotype. There are differences in co-receptor usage. You know, these are things that happen in viral culture. There are differences in the target cells. There are differences even in clinical picture studies have been done in West Africa. There are differences in the progression to death. And there may be differences in response to drugs, and perhaps we need to take this into account when developing vaccines. At epidemiological level, what's the significance? This is the map of the distribution of the subtypes, and C is in Southern Africa. And I give you this map to show that Southern Africa is the region that is worst affected by the epidemic. You know, and this at least is clear suggestion that subtype C is a little different, and with the other studies that have been done, you know, on laboratory, clinical, pathological features, this is a reasonable explanation of the epidemic. I will move on to what is being done, and then I'll quicken the pace so that we have a discussion rather than me spend all the time rambling. These are the things that are being done. So prevention, people talk a lot of the ABC program popularized by Uganda: abstinence, be faithful, condomize. And it makes intuitive sense. If sexual activity is a route of transmission, if you don't engage in sexual activity, then you are not going to have any AIDS. And if you are going to be faithful, restrict yourself to one partner, and both of you are uninfected, you are not going to have AIDS. If you use a condom is very effective in preventing HIV transmission. And people accept this. The unfortunate point is that they end there. You know, people are not abstinent. People are not faithful. People don't use condoms. So the real question in prevention strategies for HIV is not whether abstinence works. It is how do you get people to abstain from sex. Now, so I could do a simple experiment. I've told you HIV is a terrible disease. All of you now know that. May you stop sex. Are you going to stop? Because that's where the real question is. Well, what are you going to do so that people are abstinent? Or what are you going to do so that everyone is faithful? What are you going to do so that everyone uses condoms every time they engage in sex? So people take it for granted. That's the popular wisdom, you know. So stop having sex. You know, and there are anecdotes. President Moi, who's the former president of Kenya, did state that on national television, you know, to all the citizens of Kenya, let's stop having sex for 1 year. Did the Kenyans stop? So the question is right there. What do you do so that you get this abstinence? So when people come and say that prevention doesn't work, they don't mean that abstinence, people who abstain still get HIV. And they don't mean that faithful people get HIV. They don't mean that people who use condoms still get AIDS. Or what they mean is that we don't have effective ways of getting people to abstain from sex. And this is very important. And that's why I said, you know, what I'm going to discuss is fairly obvious. We just need a scientific approach, you know, to breaking down things and analyzing what is possible and what is not. I'll run through some data because education is critical. You know, education is usually cited as a link. You know, educate people so that they abstain, educate them on the use of condoms. And then by education, I mean broadly everything. You know, some people call it information, some people call it communication, some people call it counseling. And I'm not saying all these things are the same, but broadly that's what I'm classifying as education. And people who study education, it is interesting when you analyze the literature. They don't exactly distinguish between general education and specific education. So sometimes they're just talking of literacy rates, and therefore they're looking at people who went to primary school, secondary school, and who went to college. And when you, this is data from Mozambique. You know, casual sex is what we have in blue. As the number of years that you spend in school, casual sex increases. So is general education useful in this case? You know, you get more educated and you engage more in casual sex. And this data is from you. And AIDS, this source, Population Services International. This is another piece of data. HIV prevalence amongst by educational status. So this is illiterate, primary, secondary. And for 1991 to 94, illiterate, they have a lower prevalence than those who went to school, primary education, and secondary education. So is general education useful, to control the HIV epidemic? Here the pattern is sort of reversed. But still, the question comes, if you send somebody to school for 12 years, that's, to secondary education, this is the gain that you are going to get in controlling the epidemic. So is general education useful? Some have talked of specific education, and by specific education, you are telling somebody that don't engage in sex, use a condom, be faithful. You are giving them information that is particularly specific for the epidemic that you're looking at. And I note Zimbabwe here. What we have here are a proportion of girls and boys who do not know how to protect themselves. So the data here essentially indicates that the majority of the persons in Zimbabwe know how to protect themselves. And there is ample data from the Zimbabwe Demographic Health Survey and other sources. They do know how to protect themselves, but still they are getting infected. So how do we explain that? Is education sufficient in controlling the HIV/AIDS epidemic? The extreme end of the argument is to go and look at people who know everything about HIV, more than the rest of society. And these are physicians and nurses. And I was working in Harare Central Hospital, and when you see a colleague dying, now you're going to educate them? Is the assumption that they do not know when they went to medical school for 5 years and did a residency, and they're the ones that have been running the central hospitals? So this is an extreme end of the argument. And I'm not saying education is useless. I'm only indicating that it is insufficient, and grossly insufficient at controlling the epidemic. And this is very simple science. This is very simple science. You stand back and think for 1-2 minutes, and you come up with such a conclusion. So this is a question. If somebody tells you, simply go and educate them. What kind of education should I give them? For how long? And if I do that, am I going to control the epidemic? If I educate everybody to the level of physicians, are we going to control the epidemic in Zimbabwe? These are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. And then this is the approach that a policymaker would take, ask specific details of what educational program would control the epidemic in Africa. The other ways of controlling the epidemic in the long run, it is hoped that we'll find a vaccine. And then this is the principle of vaccination. I would prefer that you ask me questions on this. The big problem for HIV is that most vaccines that we have experience with, you simply get a weakened form of the virus or a weakened form of the bacterium, and that is what you administer as a vaccine. Now, for HIV, it is difficult to tell what a weakened form of HIV is. For HIV, from infection, there is an asymptomatic phase, then you get symptoms, and then you develop AIDS and die in about 10 years. Or what is a weakened form of HIV? And are we going to run trials for 15, 20 years, to really see that this is a weakened form of HIV? That is a problem, a practical problem that has been faced. And therefore, people have split it. So we are not going to give a weakened form of HIV as the vaccine. We're going to split it up, and give components. So you get recombinant proteins, synthetic peptides, naked DNA, all sorts of approaches that people are trying to develop to develop a vaccine. And the second problem is that we don't know what represents protective immunity. So the normal test that is done for HIV infection is based on antibodies. In other words, people who progress and die have antibodies and have T-cell responses. So you have to identify specific antibodies that are protective, and that is what is called correlates of immune protection. Basically, they are not known. I'm not saying there isn't interesting work that has been done to suggest what they may be, but this is one of the big problems in developing an HIV vaccine. And the School of Public Health has done a lot of work. These are some of the publications. This is some of the work that I've participated in. On defining HIV, especially subtype C, on defining characteristics of the population that we intend to use the vaccine on defining the recognition, the CTLs are cells that respond to the HIV in the particular populations and trying to correlate them with viral load. This is all work in vaccine development. What has been shown to be effective are drugs, and several drugs have been discovered. There is T20, which acts at the point of fusion here. There are reverse transcriptase inhibitors, which act at this point of transcribing the viral RNA into DNA, and they are subclassified into two. And there are protease inhibitors, which inhibit the enzyme that chops up, that is involved in the final processing before the virions bud. And then treatment, like in any other disease, there's different outcomes. Some do well, some do badly, and there are many reasons for that. There's a lot of politics regarding whether we should treat HIV in Africa. I included this slide because this is a lab in Botswana that was built as part of a partnership between the Harvard AIDS Institute and the government of Botswana. And it is true that there are problems with infrastructure in Africa. Many people interpret that to mean that we're not going to do anything. This is an example of a different kind of interpretation. If you say there is no infrastructure, then you help out, you do what you can to develop that infrastructure. And my boss, Max Essex, was very instrumental in setting up this facility. And Zimbabwe is very beautiful. This is Victoria Falls. I have a duty to show this wherever I speak. So I'll stop here. And I've spoken for too long. I hope to get some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you elaborate on the political problems concerning AIDS, especially in sub-Saharan Africa? You'd said on that close to the end.
Well, part of it is based on what you take the problem to be in Africa. And then politicians look at the broad scheme of things and at what they want out of the system. So some of the popular wisdom in political circles is that the governments are responsible. And that is why there's a lot of emphasis on what President Mbeki has been doing in South Africa, that in Zimbabwe, the Robert Mugabe is undemocratic and nothing is possible to do in such a country, and the politics of AIDS. So to some, it may make sense if you do an analysis. You simply have to compare Zimbabwe and Botswana, which is one of the ideal countries, democratic, has a significant amount of its own money, to tell that there is no difference in the epidemic between Botswana and Zimbabwe. And therefore, these explanations aren't true. A more important problem is that of financing. So countries in Africa cannot afford or did not and still do not afford the antiretroviral drugs. So the question comes, where do we get the money from? The rich countries should assist us. Which ones are the rich countries? The US, Western Europe, Japan. So how do we get them to assist us? And then you form the global fund, you lobby, and you do all sorts of things. And then if George Bush doesn't want to sponsor, that's where the politics is. He did pledge $15 billion, and then for me that's a significant amount of money, and then we do thank him for that. But by politics, I mean the broad discussions, and that is exactly where the science is confused. So when you speak to people and they can't tell what is actually happening in Africa, it is not because the science is complicated. As I've shown you, I think the science is fairly simple, and in most instances, we don't need absolute knowledge. We can use deductive reasoning. We can use inductive reasoning, where you infer a little beyond what the exact data that you have. And in most instances, you actually end up using what is called abductive reasoning. The best explanation that is available. So when you hear people saying that we really don't know what is happening in Africa, and therefore we cannot assist, this is politics. This is politics. This is not scientific reasoning. Nothing has ever been absolutely known. We use the methods that are available. We come up with reasonable conclusions. And based on those reasonable conclusions, we we need to act. So politics covers everything. Covers the financing, covers even the kind of research that is being done. And it is said that the people who fuel the other theories are not stupid people. They are scientists and physicians, but they are simply engaging in politics. So when a fellow colleague from Harvard or from Yale comes and tells you that it is morality, that's a problem in Africa. It is you ought to believe him. He is the expert on that, and not you. And that is exactly where the politics is. Where you end up failing to discern what is true and what could actually help contain this epidemic. Yes, sir.
Could you speak about the state of coming up with a vaccine and kind of where that is in the progression of finding one for different types? Or
people have so nobody knows how to design the vaccine. That's the truth. And then so what do? You come up with a hypothesis based on the studies that have been done. You come up with a hypothesis. You say that based on this genetic analysis that has been done, I think a vaccine should be designed based on the strain that is circulating, for example, in Southern Africa. And that is the approach that Max Essex at the School of Public Health has taken. So what do you do with that? You go and analyze the subtype C that is circulating in Southern Africa. And the second question is, does the vaccinee population matter? There is a lot of data, for example, from transplantation that the HLA immune response genes are different, between races, between Africans and Europeans, and even between ethnic groups within races. That is why you need to be matched to a donor if transplantation is going to occur. But we don't know what is appropriate for AIDS vaccine design. Somebody will say, no, I'll just design a magic bullet. It will work for all populations everywhere in the world. And somebody will come up and say that, I think the better way is to do HLA analysis in Southern Africa. And then you go and do that. And you take a next step. So I've done these 2 steps. I need to learn what is being recognized in those patients that are infected. And you characterize the immune responses. And you try to correlate them, to something that indicates protection. And you can use viral load. You can use CD4 count. There are groups of people that have been described as fairly resistant to the virus, long-term non-progressors. In Kenya and Gambia, people actually described what they called persistently exposed but seronegative. And these were commercial sex workers who had been exposed but were negative. So you could use all those approaches to come up with designs. So all the leading laboratories in the world have a construct of one sort or another. The next step is to move into people, because that's the only way you can test that this vaccine actually works. So in summary, I would say that there is a lot of science that has been done, and a lot that is promising. Now, this is from a scientific point of view. From a practical point of view, the steps that are needed, to move from basic science into development, into the clinical trials. And in clinical trials, what you do is you take, for example, 1,000 people, you split them into 2 groups, 500, 500. And to this 500, you give the vaccine. To another 500, you give placebo, something that looks like the vaccine but is not the vaccine. And then you follow them up to see whether they get infected or not. And if those that you've given the vaccine do not get infected, then you can infer, conclude that the vaccine is protective. So that kind of trial to follow up people and watch them getting infected, depends on the incidence rates. And if people are getting infected at 2% per year or 7% per year, for you to get sufficient endpoints, it takes 3 to 5 years. So from a practical standpoint, we were a minimum of 10 years away from the vaccine. Numbers are difficult to say, but we will not have a vaccine, I think, in the coming decade. And that's different from saying there's been a lot of progress in the science. But people have constructs, and there are actually vaccines that are in trials. In Botswana, we collaborated with Epi-Immune, and there is a vaccine that is currently in trials. Yes, sir.
Hi. You mentioned a number of sort of behavioral approaches that, if people adopted them, would address AIDS. And then you stated several times, I think convincingly, that simply having people be aware of them doesn't necessarily mean they're going to adopt those behaviors. True in Africa and probably other places as well. Are there any examples either in Africa or outside of it, where people have been able to successfully educate people, maybe not the broad populace, but specific areas based on specific programs? And if so, what are the methods that they're using to do that that might be different from sort of a general education?
The problem is that there are no proper trials. So the HIV incidence and prevalence has sort of fluctuated in certain regions. And when it goes down, everybody says this program has worked. And you can't actually attribute it to the program because many things have happened. That's the problem with the data. That is, even World Health Organization and UNAIDS has cited certain countries as success examples. One is Senegal, with the prevalence that has remained below 1.5%. But then the countries in West Africa are roughly there, or 1.5% to 2%. So you have to look at Senegal's neighbors, say Senegambia, Mali, all the way down to Sierra Leone, Liberia. All of them are in 1-2% regions. So it is difficult to conclude that whatever Senegal did is responsible for the state of the epidemic there. Uganda is the other example that is cited, and that is where the ABC program came from. And it is difficult to state convincingly that this is responsible for the declines that have been noted. What I can say with certainty is that people died in Uganda. You get people infection rates to a certain level, and then they died. It was one of the first countries that experienced that level of death, and it could be responsible. Everybody got some form of education, out of lack of another words to use, from the death that surrounded them. And then Uganda is something like close to 2 million cumulative AIDS orphans. Uganda alone. And then it has subsequently had some modest declines. So some people then interpret that it is the ABC approach. It could be anything else. So I'm not sure. From my own point of view, I think the best way is to demonstrate in proper trials. If you think that theater is the best way, to educate people and convince them by peer interactions, then you've got to design a trial where you implement this program in this district, and in a neighboring district you implement something different, and you compare so that everything else is controlled for, and we can tell with certainty that this program is responsible for the reduction, and this is the magnitude of reduction that we're likely to get if we implement this program. And therefore, if we implement it in the whole country, we expect our prevalence or incidence to drop by such a fraction. So there is a lot of data, a lot of claims. I don't particularly believe them.
One more? A question to do with something I heard on the radio, and that's that we have two different generations in this country who treat AIDS very differently. Those of us who have seen friends and colleagues that have died of the disease, I think, are more likely to take it more seriously, but they said that there's a lot of prevalence of problems with like college kids and high school kids, because they seem to believe that if you do get AIDS, you just take a pill and that's okay, that takes care of the symptoms. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the education, on that. And there's actually a second part of that question is, since we're controlling the symptoms better, is that going to this is going to sound very cold, but have people live longer and then spread AIDS more because they're living longer?
That is true. But this takes us into moral philosophy. So what should we do? Should we let people die, or save them and have that risk that they will continue transmitting? And then people have suggestions. If you take the basic approach that a physician takes, everybody is entitled to treatment. And I think a guy called Mencken put it, in philosophical terms, that our purpose as physicians, the purpose of medicine, is not to make men virtuous. It is to save him from his vices. There are a lot of people who smoke. When they develop lung cancer, are you obliged to do lung bypass surgeries? There are many people who eat McDonald's and other foods, and develop coronary artery disease. Shall we allow them to get the triple or quadruple bypass surgeries that are now available? And when you ask the question in reverse, the reverse question, the extreme end is that, is there any disease for which we are not responsible in the causation to some extent, And the answer is most likely no. You know, you contribute one way or the other. In an accident, you chose to drive and you drove a particular manner, perhaps after having drunk a glass of wine. You know, if you are involved in an accident, should we take you to a hospital? So this goes beyond the facts that are available into what we seek out of our societies, what we are as humans. And the simple medical or public health approach is that we should assist each other. You know, I'm not perfect, and I don't think any of you is perfect. You know, I have my contributions to society, but when I get coronary artery disease, please accept me for bypass surgery. And I will treat somebody of their AIDS. You know,
Part of that question was that you would think if that's the theory, that if people are living longer on with the medications, and then you would think that AIDS would spread more, then you would think that we would be caught up in the United States to what's going on in Africa. Well, you answered a slightly different question.
Yeah, but what I've said is also applicable. You know, we have responsibilities to each individual. And even somebody that, you know, somebody who's a criminal or a thief, you still treat him, and knowing that he will probably cause more damage to the society. So that's a philosophical answer. In terms of the interactions between treatment and prevention, the studies actually indicate the reverse. So when you treat a person, you suppress their viral load. And there are studies that have been done to indicate that the viral load goes down in blood. It also goes down in sexual fluids, vaginal secretions, and the semen. And that person is likely to transmit less than somebody who's not been treated. So there are indications that there are strong synergies between treatment and prevention. And people are actually pushing for treatment, saying that it will also augur well for the efforts in prevention. Now, the extension in life, you know, that's something that comes with the treatment. I don't know if you have a suggestion. Should we treat them or not?
I just wondered if that was the theory, then you would think that the rate would go down in South Africa because they're not getting very much treatment. And it's still spreading there. So it just, the science doesn't seem to be there to support it. I don't know. I just asked you to comment.
There is complex mathematics on, you know, the equilibrium rate. It depends on the number of new infections, it depends on the number of deaths, and it depends on other changes in the population. And there are mathematical formulae to calculate that. And I probably don't have to burden everyone with the epidemiological analysis. But what you are saying is to some extent true, and that's why I quoted the example in Uganda, that part of the declines in the prevalence could be explained by the death of persons that occurred in that country. We could discuss that a little further.
Thank you very much.